Hey guys, this video is sponsored by Nvidia and MSI, so stick around until the end to learn more about the MSI GeForce RTX 30 series laptops. Regardless of how people feel about Gearbox Software or Randy Pitchford, you can't deny that they gave us some pretty good content when it came to the Half-Life series.
Did it real cute, Jack.
Not only did they create the awesome Opposing Force, an expansion pack which still might be one of the best expansion packs of all time, they also created the PlayStation port for Half-Life, which is about as good a port as you could possibly ever hope for. Not to mention, it also came with its own unique campaign, putting two players into the HEV boots of the only other people lucky enough to don those iconic hazard suits, forcing you to work together to complete a short campaign designed entirely around co-op play. And then finally, they gave us Half-Life's third and final expansion pack with Blue Shift, one of the few times that Valve has actually been able to count to 3. Letting you see the events of that fateful day in the bowels of the Black Mesa facility through a third set of eyes, this time those of Barney Calhoun.
About that beer I owed you.
Yeah, that guy, another NPC who, despite existing in that game by the dozens, got turned into a single, standalone character in the sequel.
I know, sir, I know.
And I came to two startling realizations the other day. Number one, that I'm losing more hair on my head daily than I'm comfortable with. And number two, that I still haven't done a video on this thing. I did a really crappy video on Half-Life a bunch of years ago. I did a less crappy one on Opposing Force. I've even talked about the port for the PlayStation 2, but for some reason I just never got around to Blue Shift. Well, today I'm here to rectify that.
Have a good one, Calhoun.
Now, this expansion pack came out in 2001, and what it always reminds me of is that big combo box that all those original Half-Life games came in. A pack that was basically that era's version of the orange box. And Blue Shift, I think, complemented the whole thing really well, being a short romp through the Black Mesa facility. Short being the key word here, and it really was kind of swan song content for the first game. I mean, from this point on, we didn't really get anything Half-Life related from Valve until Half-Life 2 came out a bunch of years later.
Ah yes, Gordon Freeman. I couldn't have asked for a finer volunteer.
And even though it often feels like a bit of an afterthought, it still fits in really well with the previous two entries. And to this day, I don't think there's ever been a game that's had its core narrative handled so well. Fuck! To this day, I don't think there's ever been a game that's had its core narrative handled so well across 3 entirely separate experiences.
Do you copy? Forget about Freeman. We're abandoning the base.
Forget about Freeman. We're abandoning the base.
Now, what I find so weird about Blue Shift is that despite it being pretty solid throughout its short tenure, there is also something kind of boring about it. I don't know, man, maybe it's got something to do with that old saying that familiarity breeds contempt, but it is definitely the weakest out of all these 3 experiences. And although you're seeing things from yet another perspective, it's kinda hard to not feel a bit of a been there, done that vibe. That's not to say it ain't fun though, and part of what I've always loved about these expansions was the way that they always attempted to connect the dots into Gordon's storyline. So that means that Blue Shift is jam-packed with lots of Half-Life stuff that people who are familiar with the other games are going to absolutely froth over. Like, remember that bit in the prologue for the first game where you're riding on the tram and go past a platform where some poor security guard's trying to get into a locked door? Yeah, well, it turns out that guard is Barney, and you'll even see Gordon moving past you on the tram at one point from his perspective. Later on near the end too, you'll even see Gordon being dragged away by those 2 Marines after being ambushed, on their way to dump him inside that trash compactor and then leave without checking that he gets squished to death. Which might be one of the dumbest moves in any form of media, ever, along with those idiot stormtroopers in Star Wars Episode 4 who let C-3PO and R2-D2 free.
If you don't mind, I'd like to take him down to maintenance.
Alright.
As you'd expect to, you also see the G-Man, back at a time when this guy was still just supposed to be some random government employee, before they turned him into whatever the hell he's supposed to be now. Honestly, there's so many bad fan theories on his motives at this point. It's the kind of stuff that just gives you an aneurysm. It's kind of weird too how each of these games have gotten shorter and shorter. I mean, Half-Life was, what, like maybe 12 hours? Opposing Force was maybe 5, and now this is around 2. I think by that logic, that means if they had made another expansion pack, it would have been over in about 15 minutes. Maybe one where you play it as a janitor, cleaning up skid marks in the Black Mesa toilets. Or it could have been one where you play it as an IT guy, going around fixing faulty workstations and helping the scientists recover their login passwords.
Hello, IT. Have you tried turning it off and on again?
Now, Blue Shift follows a similar pattern to the other games, that being you're just beginning yet another ordinary day on the job before things go to hell.
They're waiting for you, Gordon, in the test chamber.
In the base game, you're obviously Gordon Freeman checking into the anomalous materials lab for yet another day of just testing samples. Adrian Shepard was being sent on an emergency mission before his dropship was shot down and then he landed in a war zone.
Get down!
And now with Barney, he's just reporting for security duty and helping out with a malfunctioning elevator.
Yeah, I know. Problems with the access system.
Which ends up turning into some kind of theme park ride or something as you watch that resonance cascade occur from this new perspective. And it is definitely the weakest out of all the three events. I mean, to be fair, you can't really compare with actually causing the cascade in Gordon's case, or being inside a military dropship that gets shot down in Shepard's. But it is still a pretty cool opening sequence and has a really awesome scripted animation with this high-speed cart flying off the rails and exploding. Even more impressive, considering I'm assuming that's all been animated by hand. Then after that, the elevator drops like it's Disneyland's Tower of Terror ride, and then you wake up and you're tasked with somehow finding your way out. This brings up one of the main things I dislike about the expansion is how they give you a crowbar as your melee weapon. Now, I know that in a facility that requires constant maintenance that crowbars would be a dime a dozen, but I mean, at this point they really had to know the status that this item had as being Gordon's iconic melee weapon. In Opposing Force, they had the good sense to replace the crowbar with a combat knife and a wrench, and I just really feel like they could have given Barney something else that fit his role more as a security guard, maybe like a nightstick or a baton. It'd make more sense and also be in line with his job role within the facility. They at least had the right idea with how armor works, because instead of being able to charge your armor at the HEV stations, which wouldn't make a lick of sense, you instead now have to pick up body armor on the ground, often from fallen security personnel. And that's also pretty grim, coming across the corpses of all your colleagues, most of whom you probably owe a beer to.
About that beer I owed you.
That's also part of what I think that Blue Shift does really well, the way that, like the other games, it really seems to capture that feeling of being stuck inside a real place.
How's it going?
Where events have often happened that you might not have been privy to, but the evidence remains in the world building. Like early on in the campaign, you come across a vehicle that's been shot to shit, and it's pretty obvious that these guys were trying to make a runner. In the driver's seat is the corpse of a scientist who obviously died first, and then on the ground near the car is a dead security guard who's obviously fallen out of the car and then crawled for a bit before buying the farm. Later on during a shootout inside a warehouse, if you go to a nearby room, you'll find the corpses of a bunch of executed scientists, which I always thought was pretty fucking metal. These are environmental storytelling elements that Half-Life introduced, Opposing Force then built upon, and that I think Blue Shift absolutely nails. I mean, even right from the get-go when you first rock up to work, you can go into the locker room at one point, watch a guy come out of a toilet stall after taking a shit, wash his hands, and then even use the hand dryer. These are the kind of small, minute details that go overlooked, but they're the reason why I think so many of these old games still have so much soul. Now, if you played Half-Life or Opposing Force, you're going to know exactly what you're in for when it comes to the combat, which is mostly shooting headcrabs and vortigons and then occasional squads of marines. Most of whom still show off some basic artificial intelligence, and in the case of the vortigons and the marines, even self-preservation, running away when they're injured. It's just that Blue Shift has condensed what really could have been an 8 or so hour long campaign into a 2-hour one, getting rid of a lot of the filler content that they might have otherwise included. Kind of skips over all that initial borderline horror stuff, you know, where you were running around under-equipped, avoiding headcrabs and headcrab zombies. I mean, it still has a couple of sections inside a pitch black vent with headcrabs lurking around the corners, but that's about it.
Surprise, motherfucker!
In the base game, it was easily an hour or more before you even first encountered the Marines and got your hands on the MP5. Here though, that process is much quicker. I mean, within an hour you'll have the Magnum, the shotgun, MP5 and grenades, and already have engaged in combat with plenty of Marines, a bunch of whom are just stationed around the facility and begging to be put out of their misery. I think at one point within the span of like 15 minutes, you go from fighting easily a dozen of these guys, manning a 50 cal to mow down even more, to blowing up a tank with an RPG. It's like they took all the best parts of surface tension from the base game and packed it into a metaphorical sardine tin. Having said that though, I think it is definitely the easiest game out of all these three. Now, I don't know if I just feel that way because I've played these games more times than I've had hot dinners. It also might be the absolute abundance of ammo you get, particularly for the Magnum and the grenade launcher, but I just find that none of the combat encounters really give you all that much bother, you know, unless you want them to. It also offers up some surprisingly clever puzzles, not to mention they're puzzles that aren't annoying or tedious to get through. Like at one point you've got to shoot these wooden wedges, causing these giant wooden spools to roll off the back of a train carriage, and it's such a simple puzzle to the point that you can easily overlook it if you're not familiar with wood surfaces being destructible. At one point there's like a rotating grinder in these waterways you need to get by, and this is done by dropping an explosive crate in the water which destroys the half of it so you can swim on by. This expansion pack could have easily been a 2-hour-long corridor shooter, but you can tell that some degree of effort has gone into making it feel a little bit less routine. Plus, it also has a very clear objective from almost the get-go.
If you still want to get out of here alive, your only hope may be to find my friend.
Instead of just mindlessly moving from area to area to try to make sense of things. You see, the main objective in Blue Shift, the goal that you get very early on, is to find someone named Dr. Rosenberg. And I want to stop there too and say that this must be a real common name for doctors, because if you Google that name, you get about a bazillion search results. Anyway, this guy's being kept hostage somewhere, so you're going around trying to find him, looking in cargo containers and broom closets. Then once you've found this guy, you'll need to escort him all the way back to this hidden entrance to an underground lab, all whilst keeping him alive during a bunch of shootouts.
Yes, here it is. We'll need to break through this to get to the elevator.
Now this could have been a hell of a lot worse, and anyone who's tried escorting NPCs in a Half-Life game I think is going to agree that the pathfinding leaves a lot to be desired. Here though, this section is short and pretty easy, and it's simple enough to make Rosenberg hang back here when you need to.
Oh, I see.
Rosenberg's plan is to then use a teleporter to get him and his buddies off the base, and this sequence in particular feels very similar to that one from Half-Life 2, which Barney coincidentally also was very hands-on with.
Alright, Barney, your turn. Gee, thanks.
Only before they can do this, someone needs to go to Zen and activate some kind of power generator, otherwise there's not going to be enough juice to get the teleporter running. Oh, and by someone, I obviously mean the player.
The field, it's open! Calhoun, enter!
Now, unlike the Zen chapters in the base game, which were about as fun as plucking out your nose hairs, Blue Shift treats Zen exactly as it should be treated. That being nothing more than a theme park ride through this bizarre looking alien world. It doesn't force you to stuff around with annoying and clunky platforming, and it just adds in a bit of combat to serve as a side dish to the weird main course, which is your detour through this otherworldly location. I think it also has some of the best looking Zen environments as well. Like, I really like how these waterfall sections look, and it goes on long enough to be an enjoyable side piece without being long enough that it just starts to wear out its welcome. Then once you're back in the land of the living, there's a final chapter where you've got to finish powering up the teleporter, because it wouldn't be a Half-Life game if it didn't have at least one chapter where you need to turn the power back on. And seriously, it's like an unwritten rule or something. This, I think, though, is easily the best part of the game. And the combat against the Marines here is where it's at its absolute peak, simply because it takes place in smaller environments where you can easily break line of sight and just punish these guys at close range with a weapon like the shotgun. Plus, it also had what I thought was one of the hardest puzzles of all time, where you've got to use a metal barrel as a makeshift fuse connection to blow up a door with explosives. This is as simple as just pushing the barrel onto the broken fuse line, and you'd think that that would be obvious, but I got stuck on this bit for I think literally hours back in the day. Anyway, then after all is said and done, you wait while Rosenberg and his boys escape one by one before then making your own harrowing escape as the Marines close in. And then, that's it, game over. Now, the main thing I dislike about Blue Shift, apart from its obviously short length, is that it really does kind of feel like Half-Life Light. It's like the margarine of Half-Life games or the Diet Coke of Half-Life games, just 1 calorie, not Half-Life enough. This is obvious from the limited enemy lineup, but also the lack up of the full weapon roster. Opposing Force at least added in a bunch of new ones, but here you're just using the same old weapons that even Gordon got his hands on, well, mostly anyway. I mean, I get the reason behind why you don't get the Gauss gun, kinda makes sense considering that that thing was a prototype, one-of-a-kind weapon that Gordon was lucky enough to even get his hands on. And off the back of that logic, you're not gonna come across the glue-on gun either, but I mean, surely they had another crossbow lying around the facility somewhere. And at least a single sequence involving a rampaging gargantua again would have added a hell of a lot to the campaign, just giving it some much more needed variety. I've always kind of thought that the ending was also oddly optimistic.
We made it, Mr. Calhoun. We made it.
I mean, compared to the base game where Gordon's just left in stasis without any real idea of how long he's going to be there, or with opposing force where Shepard was left in stasis, again, without any real idea of how long he's going to be there.
I'm sure you can imagine there are worse alternatives.
Barney, on the other hand, is outside in broad daylight like there's not a single care in the world. There's no soldiers or aliens nearby, and it's about as far removed from a threatening environment as you could possibly get.
We made it, Mr. Calhoun. We made it.
Did kind of seem like Barney got things pretty cushy too, right? I mean, in Half-Life 2, he seems to have a stable job as a Metro cop, at least in the sense that the Combine trust him, and you'd have to assume that the dude is being fed well. He certainly looks happy and has an optimistic attitude, you know, considering the state of the rest of the world.
Yeah, longer if we're lucky.
And maybe cushy is the best way to describe his journey in total.
Yeah, you and me both, Doc.
He didn't have to take on the Nylanth or a giant space worm coming out of an interdimensional portal to make his escape. He just had to fight back against a bunch of Marines and the odd Vortigaunt here and there. So Barney, mate, I don't think you just owe Gordon a beer. I think you owe him an entire brewery. Still though, as a shooter that takes the better part of 2 hours to get through, Blue Shift is a tight, solid little expansion pack, clearly put together by people who know that Gold Source engine in and out. Like a Bob Ross painting, it's not going to show you anything you haven't seen before, but there's a sense of proficiency and capability with what the engine's created here that makes it possible to overlook the technological shortcomings. Considering, I think by this point, that Gold Source engine was well and truly past its prime. At the time this thing came out, it received a bit of negativity for the dated visuals, but it's kind of interesting in the way that time has really been kind to these older shooters, with the resurgence of ironically simple graphics coming back now as a purposeful design choice. Still though, they did try to update things back then with the so-called HD models, and yeah man, I could talk about these things all day long if I had to. These HD models encapsulate everything that I hate about that old adage where people just assume that because something is newer that it's automatically better. Now I want to say I'm not entirely against the new HD models that Blue Shift added in, and I think in some cases it actually looks better. Like the first aid and the HEV wall charges are definitely improved now, and compare the original Spaz 12 model to that high resolution one, I mean the difference is just huge. And much like the newer version of the Magnum, I think I actually prefer it. Lord knows they did some weird perspective black magic to pull off that Magnum in the original game.
God damn!
Even if it is an Anaconda now instead of a Magnum. With the scientist models, they managed to look more detailed, but also stay true to the art style of the base game, and the zombie models are also a lot more improved, coming off a lot more detailed. You can even now see all these gnarly teeth coming out of their chests, and all the appendages coming off their mutated bodies are now more pronounced. The thing that really chaps my ass though is how they've changed the MP5 to an M4. Now, I get why they did this. I've encountered enough gun nuts online as it is going on about how that MP5 would never have an underslung grenade launcher, but when I think of Half-Life's guns, I think of the MP5. It's one of the most common workhorse weapons, and the sound that thing makes is burned into my brain. So changing it to an M4 just makes no sense to me, and having the Marines use it again makes no sense, considering all the marketing material for opposing force showed Shepard clearly holding an MP5. Same thing with the pistol, it's now gone from being a Glock to being replaced with a Beretta. And this is probably the weirdest one too, because looking at that cover art for Blue Shift, I mean Barney's not even holding either one of these. Now apparently we have the Dreamcast port to thank for all of this, or should I say the cancelled Dreamcast port. It said that these models were originally intended for that version, and I guess they got carried over to Blue Shift when that version got shit canned. A choice which I think is incredibly odd and made by someone who, I don't know, I guess just hated the smell of money. The PS2 port for Half-Life is this weird amalgamation of the original and the HD models, and I think manages the best of both worlds in terms of the detail and aesthetic. And I know that I've used the HD models in all of my footage, but I compare it to George Lucas throwing a bunch of CGI shit on the original Star Wars films, and I still think the best way to play these games is with those original models from back in 1998. You know, along with seeing Han shoot first in 1977. But I'll be honest, right? One of the main reasons I wanted to talk about Blue Shift was so I had a reason to talk about this new Black Mesa mod that's in development called Black Mesa Blue Shift, developed by HECU Collective. And in lieu of Black Mesa opposing force, well, this thing's gonna have to do. Well, if you're familiar with Black Mesa, well, then this is pretty much just the exact same thing. It's something made by a bunch of very talented modders and map makers, trying to recreate the original campaign, but updating it visually and making it feel more modern. Crowbar Collective achieved this to great effect with Black Mesa, and from what has been completed so far here, these guys seem to be on the same trajectory. They even managed to keep in the Glock pistol instead of a Beretta, and I mean, that right there alone earns them all the kudos in the world.
You want to squeeze in a few shots in the range.
Plus, I really like this animation of Barney putting on his security vest and helmet. Feels like a really cool modern inclusion, making you feel like you're really assuming the role. Now, the first thing you notice about this version is just how gorgeous the whole thing looks, and it's kind of crazy to think that this mod is available to play for free considering the detail and polish in some of these areas, especially with the lighting effects, some of which just look amazing. It's also really fun going through this thing and comparing the original sequences from Blue Shift to those in the remake.
Have a good one, Calhoun. Have a good one, Calhoun.
And the Resonance Cascade event is a perfect example of how they've taken the concept of the original and then shot a lightning bolt up its ass. Plus, they just go way more overboard on all the world building details, even including some more NPCs for the player to interact with.
Have at him, Doc.
Like the third chapter, for instance, Duty Calls as a scripted sequence where a jumpy scientist knocks you over the back of the head with a crowbar. And then another extended bit where you're being assisted by another security guard who I really hope you meet up with later on because this guy is an absolute G.
Man, sorry about the friendly fire. You're the first familiar face I've seen in hours.
It also recreates a lot of the same puzzles but makes them more complex. Like with that explosive crate puzzle, now instead of only needing to find one on that nearby freight elevator, you've now got to find 3. Even going off on a whole little side mission to repair the freight elevator to begin with. There's a whole sequence where you've got to get the power back on in this area that's half flooded and then survive an ambush against a dozen Vortigons. And it's just a cool way of making these familiar chapters seem fresh, but also throw in a few curveballs that you might not see coming. About the only thing that still puts a thistle up my pee hole is how Black Mesa kind of fucks around with how the balancing works. You know, with like the headcrabs and the Vortigons both attacking way faster, which is something that kind of ruins the pacing of the combat of the original games. And again, this is all present in this version. But it also adds back in what I think is the most important stuff, and it's all those light horror elements. People often forget, I think, how tense those first few areas for Half-Life and Opposing Force could be, before you had all that many weapons or ammo and had to make your way past droves of headcrabs and headcrab zombies. These new areas that they've added in build upon that, adding back in a few more spooky areas where resources are tighter than a duck's asshole, and you're in tight corridors against all these enemies with a massively dwindling ammo supply. And I think getting through the third remake chapter alone took me longer than the entirety of the base game. So clearly they're also going to build upon the biggest criticism that version had, you know, being its short length. This thing is still a ways off being finished though. I mean, it took them a whole year just to get chapter 3 finished, so I don't know what that says about how long it's going to be until we can play chapter 4, which I think is easily the longest in the entire game. It took the Black Mesa guys the better part of a decade to finish that, and while Blue Shift is a fraction of the length of Half-Life, so I'd imagine too is HECU Collective's team. I still don't think we're going to see Half-Life 3 in the near future. In fact, I don't think I'll see another game in the rest of my lifetime. So, going back and replaying a fan-made campaign based off the original trilogy's third best entry might be the best you're going to get for the time being. And at the end of the day, it's still going to be better than Hunt Down the Freeman.
Gee, thanks.
Right, so thanks for sticking around, and now that I've got your attention, let me tell you about MSI's new GE76 laptop. Now this thing right here is the ultimate gaming laptop. MSI were nice enough to send me one that had an Nvidia GeForce RTX 3080 Ti, and I gotta say that this thing is just an absolute beast. As you'd expect from a 30 series, it also has the latest Nvidia RT cores for ray trace gaming, plus performance boosting features like DLSS and Nvidia Reflex. The G76 uses Nvidia Max-Q technology to optimize performance across the GPU and the CPU, which means more fidelity in frames. Yeah, and speaking of fidelity in frames, you got a bunch of display options for that 17.3-inch screen. And then online gamers who want to max out their FPS can opt for the 1080p build that goes up to 360Hz. Yeah, shit.
Get down!
Now, in the time that I got to play with this thing, I threw a few games at it, just absolutely maxing them out here, and the performance across the board was just really damn solid. Doom Eternal maxed out, for instance, just ran like absolute greased lightning. It was also able to handle RE2 with all its new bells and whistles that they added in with that latest update. But then, even going back to playing something like Quake 2 RTX, which is something you wouldn't think would be all that resource intensive, and yet still managed to pretty much brick my old desktop, well, this laptop just makes the whole thing a bitch. All that power needs plenty of juice, and the G76 has a 99.9 watts per hour battery, plus it also detects and adjusts system performance between these modes to find the right mix between performance and longevity. If you like to match your gear, you can pair that G76 with all the other exclusive MSI gaming too. So if all of this is sounding like your jam, well, check out that link in the description to find out more.